I walked into my daughter's pristine Seattle apartment with homemade lasagna in one hand and a folder of old family photos in the other, ready to share the story about how her great-grandmother survived the Great Depression by selling hand-knitted scarves. What I didn't expect was to find divorce papers scattered across her granite countertop and my son-in-law packing boxes in the bedroom. "Mom, please," Jessica said without even looking up from her laptop, "stop telling the same stories. I've heard about great-grandma's scarves 1,000 times." Little did she know that within 48 hours I'd be telling entirely new stories to my lawyer about the $2.3 million trust fund she'd been secretly draining for the past 3 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 62, I thought I understood heartbreak. I'd buried my husband of 35 years, watched my only child struggle through law school, and spent the last decade trying to fill the silence in our family home in Portland, Oregon. But standing in Jessica's apartment that Tuesday evening, watching her wave off my presence like I was an irritating fly, I realized I'd been naive about the different kinds of pain a mother could experience. The lasagna grew cold in my hands as I took in the scene before me. Moving boxes lined the hallway, and there was an energy in the air that spoke of major life changes happening without my knowledge. Again. Jessica had always been independent, graduating summa cum laude from law school, landing a position at one of Seattle's most prestigious firms, marrying David Chen in a courthouse ceremony that I'd only heard about after the fact. She claimed they'd wanted something small and simple, just the 2 witnesses required by law. I'd convinced myself then that it was just her personality, that she'd inherited her father's practical nature and didn't see the point in elaborate celebrations. But now, seeing her dismiss my attempt to connect through our family stories, I wondered if there was something deeper at play. Something that made her see my presence as burden rather than blessing. "Jessica, honey, what's going on here?" I asked, setting the lasagna down on her kitchen island, careful not to disturb the legal documents spread across the surface. "Are you and David moving?" She finally looked up from her MacBook, her dark eyes tired behind designer glasses that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. At 32, my daughter had achieved everything I'd dreamed for her and more. She wore success like armor, from her perfectly styled black hair to her tailored blazer that she hadn't bothered to change out of despite being home for hours. "We're separating, Mom." I thought it was obvious. Her voice carried the same tone she used when explaining legal concepts to clients she considered intellectually inferior. "David's moving back to his parents' place in Bellevue while we figure out the details." The words hit me like ice water. Jessica and David had been married for only 18 months, and while I hadn't seen much of them during that time, they'd seemed happy enough during our brief holiday visits. David was quiet but kind, a software engineer who seemed to balance Jessica's intensity with his steady calm. Separating? But why? What happened? I moved closer to her, the same instinct that had driven me to tend scraped knees and broken teenage hearts kicking in despite her obvious reluctance to engage. "It's complicated, Mom. Adult relationships are complicated. Not everything can be fixed with one of your stories about how great-grandma overcame adversity through the power of positive thinking." Jessica's fingers flew across her keyboard as she spoke, multitasking even during this conversation about her marriage falling apart. I felt the familiar sting of her dismissal, but this time it carried extra weight. She wasn't just rejecting my attempt to comfort her. She was rejecting the very foundation of how I'd tried to connect with her throughout her life. The stories I told weren't just entertainment or meaningless chatter. They were our family history, threads that connected her to generations of strong women who'd faced their own challenges and survived. "Those stories matter, Jessica. They're part of who you are, who we are as a family." She stopped typing and looked at me with something that might have been pity. "Mom, I know you mean well, but I'm dealing with real problems here. Legal problems, financial problems, career implications. I don't have time for fairy tales about people who died before I was born." David emerged from the bedroom then, carrying a suitcase and looking uncomfortable about the domestic drama he was walking into. He'd always been polite to me, if somewhat distant, but there was something different about his demeanor now. He looked defeated, worn down in a way that suggested this separation hadn't been his choice. "Hello, Mrs. Morrison," he said quietly, his usual polite smile not quite reaching his eyes. "I'm sorry you have to see all this. David, sweetheart, what's really going on here? You two seemed so happy at Christmas." Jessica answered before he could speak. "People grow apart, Mom. It happens. We want different things, have different priorities. It's better to end it now before things get messy." But David was shaking his head slightly. A gesture so small I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching his face carefully. There was something he wasn't saying, something Jessica was controlling about this narrative, just like she controlled every other aspect of her carefully curated life. "Well," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "if there's anything I can do to help, anything at all, you know I'm here for you. Both of you." "Actually, there is something," Jessica said, and for a moment I felt hopeful that she was finally going to let me in, let me be useful in her adult life the way I'd longed to be. "I need you to sign some paperwork related to Dad's estate. There are some tax implications I'm trying to sort out, and as the primary beneficiary of his life insurance policy, I need your signature to transfer some assets." My heart sank. Of course. She needed something from me, which was the only time I ever heard from her these days. Not for comfort, not for advice, not for the simple pleasure of my company, but for my signature on documents I probably wouldn't understand. "What kind of paperwork?" I asked, my voice smaller than I intended. "Just routine stuff. Estate planning, trust management. I've been handling all of Dad's financial affairs since he died, trying to maximize the benefits for both of us. There are some investment opportunities that require moving money between accounts." David cleared his throat softly. "Jessica, maybe your mom should have her own lawyer look at those documents before she signs anything." The look Jessica shot her husband was sharp enough to cut glass. "David, this is family business. Mom trusts me to handle these things, don't you, Mom?" I found myself nodding, even though something in David's suggestion made sense. But Jessica was a lawyer after all, and she'd been managing Harold's affairs since his death 4 years ago. She understood these things better than I ever could. "Of course, honey. You know I trust your judgment completely." David's expression grew even more troubled, but he didn't say anything else. He picked up his suitcase and another box, heading for the door. "I'll be back tomorrow for the rest of my things," he said quietly. "Take your time," Jessica replied without looking up from her laptop. "I'll be in court most of the day anyway." I watched David leave, noting how he paused at the door as if he wanted to say something more but ultimately just walked out into the Seattle drizzle. The apartment felt different after he left, emptier somehow, though Jessica's presence alone should have filled it. "Mom, about those documents." Jessica continued as if nothing significant had just happened. "I'll have them ready by tomorrow evening. Can you come by again around 6? "Of course." "But Jessica, are you sure you're okay? This must be difficult for you, even if you think it's for the best." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She finally closed her laptop and looked at me directly. "Mom, I appreciate your concern, but I'm fine. I'm a grown woman, I'm successful, I make good decisions. I don't need to be coddled or comforted with stories about ancestors I never met. What I need is for you to trust that I know what I'm doing with my life." I gathered up the lasagna, which she hadn't even acknowledged, and my folder of photos, which felt suddenly foolish and antiquated in her modern apartment. "I'll see you tomorrow then." As I drove back to Portland through the rain, I couldn't shake David's words about getting my own lawyer. Not because I didn't trust Jessica, but because something about the whole situation felt wrong. My daughter's marriage was falling apart, she was dismissing my attempts to connect with her, and she needed me to sign papers that she couldn't explain in simple terms. Harold had always handled our finances, but he'd been careful to include me in major decisions, to explain things in ways I could understand. He'd never made me feel stupid for asking questions. But Jessica had inherited his head for numbers, along with his impatience for what she saw as inefficiency. That night, I sat in Harold's old chair in our living room, surrounded by the photo albums and scrapbooks I'd been organizing since his death. 4 years of trying to make sense of a lifetime of memories. Trying to create something meaningful that I could pass down to Jessica if she ever wanted it. The stories she dismissed so casually weren't just random anecdotes. They were lessons. Examples of resilience and creativity and love that had been passed down through generations. When I told her about great-grandmother's scarves, I wasn't just filling silence. I was trying to show her that the women in our family had always found ways to survive, to thrive, to take care of each other. But maybe Jessica was right. Maybe those stories belonged to a different time. A different world. Maybe my daughter didn't need the comfort of family history because she'd built something better, something more substantial. Something that didn't require the fragile threads of memory and tradition. I picked up one of Harold's financial folders, one of many that I'd largely ignored since his death. Jessica had handled everything, she'd said, filing the appropriate papers, managing the investments, making sure I was taken care of. She'd been so competent, so efficient, that I'd been grateful to let her handle details that felt overwhelming in my grief. But looking at the folder now, I realized I didn't actually understand what taken care of meant in concrete terms. I knew I had enough money to live comfortably, to keep the house, to maintain my modest lifestyle. But I'd never looked closely at the actual numbers, the specific accounts, the paperwork that governed my financial security. Maybe it was time I did. The next morning, I called my old friend Margaret, who'd gone through her own complicated estate issues when her husband passed away 3 years earlier. She'd mentioned having a good lawyer, someone who specialized in family financial matters and didn't make widows feel stupid for asking questions. "Ellen, honey, of course I remember Mr. Reeves," Margaret said when I called. "He's wonderful, very patient, very thorough. Are you having problems with Harold's estate?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Jessica's been handling everything, but she wants me to sign some new paperwork, and I'm starting to think I should understand what I'm signing." "Absolutely you should. Harold would want you to understand your own finances. Do you want me to call Mr. Reeves for you? He might be able to see you today if I explain the situation." 2 hours later, I was sitting in a comfortable office in downtown Portland, across from a man in his 50s, who wore kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and spoke to me like I was an intelligent human being, rather than a confused old woman. "Mrs. Morrison," Thomas Reeves said, spreading the financial documents I'd brought across his desk, "these are quite extensive holdings. Your husband was very successful, very careful with his investments." "Yes. He always said he wanted to make sure I'd be comfortable if anything happened to him." Mr. Reeves nodded, studying the papers with growing concentration. "And your daughter has been managing these accounts since his death?" "Jessica's a lawyer, and she understood all this better than I did. She said she was optimizing everything, making sure I got the maximum benefit." "I see." His tone was neutral, but something in his expression made me sit forward. "Is something wrong?" He looked up at me, and I saw the same kind of careful consideration that David had shown the night before, as if he was weighing how much truth I could handle. "Mrs. Morrison, I need to ask you some questions about these accounts, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you been receiving regular income from these investments?" "Well, yes, Jessica deposits money into my checking account every month. She said it was better to automate everything so I wouldn't have to worry about it." "How much?" I told him the amount, which had always seemed generous enough to cover my expenses with a comfortable margin. Mr. Reeves made some notes, did some calculations, and frowned at his computer screen. "Mrs. Morrison, based on the value of these accounts when your husband died, you should be receiving considerably more income than what you're getting. Either the investments have performed very poorly, which seems unlikely given the market over the past 4 years, or what? Or funds are being withdrawn for other purposes." The room seemed to tilt slightly. "What other purposes?" Mr. Reeves turned his computer monitor toward me, showing a spreadsheet that made my head spin. These are the transaction records I can access through public databases. There have been substantial withdrawals from your accounts over the past 3 years, totaling approximately $2. 3 million. I stared at the numbers, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But Jessica said she was investing the money, growing it for the future. Some of these withdrawals correspond with real estate purchases, stock purchases, business investments, but they're not in your name, Mrs. Morrison. They're in your daughter's name. The office went quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. I felt like I was falling, the same disorienting sensation I'd experienced when the doctor told me Harold's cancer was terminal. Reality shifting, the ground I thought was solid suddenly revealing itself to be quicksand. Are you telling me that Jessica has been stealing from me? I'm telling you that your daughter has been using your inherited funds to make investments in her own name, which may or may not have been done with your full knowledge and consent. The question is whether you authorized these transactions. I thought about all the papers Jessica had brought me over the years, documents she'd explained quickly before asking me to sign. Trust transfers, investment authorizations, tax documents. I'd sign them all without question, because I trusted her, because she was my daughter, because she was the lawyer, and I was just the widow who didn't understand complicated financial matters. I think I signed papers that let her do this, but I didn't understand what they meant. Mr. Reeves nodded grimly. That's what I was afraid of. Mrs. Morrison, I need to ask you another question. Are you planning to sign additional documents for your daughter in the near future? I thought about my promise to return to Jessica's apartment that evening, about the new paperwork she needed me to sign to handle tax implications and investment opportunities. Yes. Tonight, actually. I would strongly advise against that until we can review exactly what you've already authorized and what the implications might be for your financial security. I sat there for a long moment, processing what I'd learned. My daughter, who I'd raised to be honest and ethical, who'd built a successful career in law, who I'd trusted implicitly with my financial future, had been systematically moving my inheritance into her own accounts for years. Mr. Reeves, if what you're telling me is true, what can I do about it? That depends on several factors. How much of this was done with your knowledge? How much can be proven to have been unauthorized? What your daughter's intentions were? But first, we need to get a complete picture of your current financial situation and freeze any accounts that might be at risk. I called Jessica from Mr. Reeves' office. Mom, you're still coming tonight, right? I have the papers ready. Actually, honey, something's come up. I'm not going to be able to make it tonight. There was a pause, and when Jessica spoke again, her voice had a sharp edge I recognized from her childhood when she didn't get her way. Mom, this is time sensitive. We need to get these documents filed by the end of the week to avoid penalty fees. What kind of penalty fees? Another pause, longer this time. Tax penalties? Estate penalties. It's complicated, but it could cost us thousands of dollars if we miss the deadline. Us? You, Mom. It could cost you thousands of dollars. But Mr. Reeves was shaking his head, pointing to something on his computer screen that suggested there were no pending deadlines. No immediate consequences to delaying whatever Jessica wanted me to sign. I think I need to understand these documents better before I sign them, Jessica. Maybe I should have a lawyer look at them. The silence that followed was arctic. Mom, I am a lawyer. I'm your daughter. I've been protecting your interests for 4 years. Why would you suddenly not trust me? Because you've been lying to me, I thought, but didn't say. Because you've been treating me like I'm incompetent, while systematically draining the accounts Harold worked his whole life to build for my security. It's not about trust, honey. It's about me being responsible for my own affairs. Fine. Jessica's voice was clipped, professional. If that's how you want to handle this, that's your choice. But don't blame me when the consequences catch up with you. She hung up before I could respond. Mr. Reeves looked at me with sympathy. I know this is difficult, Mrs. Morrison. Family financial disputes are always painful. What happens now? Now we do a complete audit of your accounts, document every transaction, and figure out exactly where you stand financially. Then we decide what legal options might be available to recover funds that were moved without proper authorization. I drove home through the Portland evening traffic, my mind reeling with numbers and implications and the growing realization that my daughter had been deceiving me for years. Not just about money, but about our relationship, about her motivations, about who she really was beneath the successful exterior I'd been so proud of. That night, I sat in Harold's chair again, but instead of looking at photo albums, I was surrounded by financial documents, bank statements, legal papers that told a story very different from the one I'd been living. My phone rang several times. Jessica. Probably. I let it go to voicemail. The first message was apologetic. Mom, I'm sorry I snapped at you. This divorce has me stressed out, and I took it out on you. Can we please just get this paperwork handled, so I can focus on getting my life back together? The second message was more manipulative. Mom, I'm really worried about you. You're not thinking clearly about this. You're going to put both of us at financial risk because you're listening to strangers instead of your own daughter. The third message was angry. Mom, if you don't call me back tonight, I'm driving down to Portland tomorrow. We need to resolve this immediately. I turned off my phone. The next morning, Mr. Reeves called with preliminary results from his research. Mrs. Morrison, I'm afraid the situation is worse than I initially thought. Not only has your daughter been moving substantial funds into her own accounts, but she's also taken out loans using your assets as collateral. You're currently liable for approximately $800,000 in debt that you probably don't even know exists. I felt my legs go weak. How is that possible? The documents you signed over the years gave her extensive power of attorney over your financial affairs. She's been using that authority very aggressively and not necessarily in your best interests. What does this mean for me? It means we need to act quickly to protect your remaining assets and to challenge these transactions. It also means you're likely going to need to take legal action against your daughter to recover what's been taken. Legal action against Jessica, the daughter I'd raised, loved, supported through law school, trusted with everything I had left of Harold's legacy. Mr. Reeves, is there any chance this is all a misunderstanding? That maybe Jessica was doing what she thought was best for me? His pause was answer enough. Mrs. Morrison, your daughter is a sophisticated attorney who knew exactly what she was doing. The pattern of transactions shows careful planning, not impulsive decisions or honest mistakes. That afternoon, Jessica showed up at my house unannounced, just as she'd threatened. I watched through the front window as she got out of her BMW, her expressions set in the determined lines I remembered from her childhood when she was preparing to argue her way out of trouble. I let her ring the doorbell twice before answering. Mom, we need to talk. She pushed past me into the house without waiting for an invitation, her eyes taking in the financial documents spread across Harold's desk in the den. What is all this? It's my life, Jessica. The life you've been managing without my knowledge or consent. She moved to the desk, rifling through the papers with the confidence of someone who is used to being in control of every situation. Mom, you're being manipulated by this lawyer. He's trying to create problems where none exist so he can charge you fees to solve them. Am I? Or am I finally understanding what you've been doing with my money for the past 4 years? Jessica turned to face me, and for the first time in our conversation, she looked uncertain. Not guilty, not apologetic, but uncertain about how much I actually knew. Everything I've done has been to protect your financial future. The investments I've made are solid. The returns have been excellent. You're much better off now than you would have been if we'd just left everything sitting in savings accounts. Investments in your name using my money. That's how these things work, Mom. I have the expertise to manage complex financial instruments. I have the legal knowledge to structure these transactions properly. You signed papers authorizing me to act on your behalf. Papers you never properly explained to me. Jessica's expression hardened. I explained everything. You chose not to pay attention because you preferred to let me handle the complicated stuff while you focused on your scrapbooks and your stories about dead relatives. The cruelty of that statement took my breath away. She'd used my trust, my grief, my willingness to let her help me, and now she was throwing it back in my face as evidence of my incompetence. I trusted you, Jessica. I trusted you because you're my daughter. And that trust has made you wealthy. The investments I've made in the past 4 years have doubled the value of your estate. You should be thanking me, not attacking me. Then why are the loan documents showing that I'm liable for $800,000 in debt I didn't know about? For the first time, Jessica looked genuinely surprised. What loan documents? I handed her the papers Mr. Reeves had discovered, watching her face as she read through them. Her surprise seemed genuine, but that didn't make me feel any better about the situation. "These aren't my loans," she said finally. "These are David's business loans. He must have used the power of attorney documents to access your accounts without my knowledge." I stared at my daughter, watching her throw her estranged husband under the bus, with the same calculating precision she'd used to manage my finances. It was masterful, really. Shift the blame, maintain her innocence, position herself as another victim of David's deception. "Jessica, David tried to warn me to get my own lawyer before signing papers for you. He's not the one who's been lying to me." Her mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw something in her expression that chilled me. Not remorse, not shame, but irritation that her carefully constructed narrative was falling apart. "Mom, you're confused. This situation is more complex than you understand. David and I have been having financial problems in our marriage, and he's been trying to turn you against me to gain leverage in the divorce proceedings." But I'd spent the morning with Mr. Reeves, going through 4 years of transactions, seeing the pattern of systematic asset transfer that had nothing to do with David and everything to do with Jessica's methodical appropriation of my inheritance. "I want you to leave," I said quietly. "What?" "I want you to leave my house. I want you to stop managing my finances. I want you to return the money you've taken from my accounts." Jessica's composure cracked completely then. "Mom, you can't do this. You don't understand the legal implications. You'll destroy both of us financially. Maybe, but at least I'll be destroyed honestly." She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw her calculating, trying to find the right words to regain control of the situation. The daughter I'd raised would have been horrified by what she'd done, would have been full of apologies and promises to make things right. But the woman standing in my living room was a stranger, someone who saw me as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be loved. "Fine," she said finally. "If this is how you want to handle things, I'll respect your wishes. But don't come crawling back to me when this lawyer has taken everything you have left and you realize I was trying to protect you." After she left, I sat in Harold's chair and tried to make sense of what my life had become. My daughter had been stealing from me for years, my financial security was in ruins, and I was facing the prospect of legal action against the only child I had left in the world. But for the first time in 4 years, I felt like I was seeing clearly. The stories I'd tried to tell Jessica weren't meaningless anecdotes about dead relatives. They were examples of women who'd faced impossible situations and found ways to survive, to fight back, to protect what mattered to them. Great-grandmother hadn't just knitted scarves during the Great Depression. She'd built a business that supported her family when her husband couldn't find work. She'd been resourceful, determined, unwilling to be a victim of circumstances beyond her control. Maybe it was time I stopped trying to tell those stories and started living them instead. The next morning, I called Mr. Reeves and told him to proceed with the legal action to recover my assets and challenge the unauthorized transactions. It would be expensive, complicated, and emotionally devastating. It would probably destroy what was left of my relationship with Jessica permanently. But it would also be the first story I'd told in years that was entirely my own. The legal papers felt heavier than they should have when Mr. Reeves handed them to me across his mahogany desk 3 days later. Asset recovery lawsuit, financial elder abuse claim, demand for full accounting of trust fund disbursements. Words that transformed my daughter from the accomplished attorney I'd bragged about at Bridge Club into a defendant in a court case that would likely destroy whatever remained of our relationship forever. "Mrs. Morrison, I want you to understand what we're embarking on here," Thomas said, his voice gentle but serious. "This isn't just about recovering money. Once we file these documents, there's no going back to the way things were. Your daughter will hire her own counsel, probably someone very good, and they'll fight every single claim we make." I stared at the signature lines, waiting for my name, thinking about all the other documents I'd signed blindly over the past 4 years. Trust amendments, investment authorizations, power of attorney expansions. Each signature had been an act of faith in Jessica's integrity, and each one had given her more control over the financial foundation Harold had built for my security. What if I'm wrong about her motivations? I asked, voicing the doubt that had been gnawing at me since our confrontation. What if she really believed she was helping me? Mr. Reeves opened a thick folder filled with bank statements, transaction records, and loan documents that painted a detailed picture of financial manipulation spanning years. Ellen. May I call you Ellen? The evidence suggests a pattern of sophisticated financial planning that went far beyond simple investment management. Your daughter created shell companies, used your assets as collateral for business ventures you never knew about, and systematically moved funds into accounts that benefit her directly while exposing you to substantial liability. He pulled out a timeline he'd constructed, color-coded to show the progression of Jessica's access to my accounts. Green for legitimate estate management, yellow for questionable but potentially defensible transactions, red for clear violations of fiduciary duty. The red items alone total over $1. $8 million, he continued, money that was moved without proper documentation, used for purposes that provided no benefit to you, invested in ventures that generated returns paid directly to your daughter's personal accounts. I traced the timeline with my finger, seeing my financial security hemorrhaging in vivid color. The green section was concentrated in the first 6 months after Harold's death, when Jessica had indeed handled legitimate estate matters efficiently and appropriately. But the yellow and red sections grew progressively larger, more frequent, more brazen as time went on, and my trust in her competence became absolute. She got bolder as she went along. I observed. That's typical in these cases. The first few unauthorized transactions are small, tentative, designed to test whether anyone's paying attention. When there are no consequences, no questions asked, the scope and frequency increase dramatically. And I never questioned anything, because I was grieving, because I trusted her, because I was grateful to have someone handling the complicated financial stuff. Ellen, you were the perfect victim for this type of fraud. Intelligent enough to understand that you needed professional help. Trusting enough to delegate authority to someone you loved. Emotionally vulnerable enough to accept explanations that didn't quite make sense. The word victim stung, but I couldn't argue with its accuracy. I'd been victimized not just by Jessica's greed, but by my own willingness to remain ignorant about my own financial affairs. Harold had always handled our money, and when he died, I'd simply transferred that dependence to our daughter without questioning whether she deserved the same blind trust. What happens when we file these papers? Jessica will be served with a summons requiring her to appear in court and respond to our allegations. She'll have 30 days to provide a formal answer and to hire legal representation. During that time, we'll request a temporary restraining order, preventing her from accessing any remaining accounts or disposing of assets that might be subject to recovery. And then? Then we begin the discovery process. We subpoena bank records, investment statements, business formation documents, loan applications. We depose Jessica under oath, along with any associates who might have assisted her in these transactions. We build a comprehensive case documenting every dollar that was moved inappropriately and calculating the damages you've suffered. The enormity of what we were undertaking settled over me like a suffocating blanket. This wasn't just a family disagreement about money management. This was a full-scale legal war against the person who'd been closer to me than anyone else in the world since Harold's death. How long will this take? Civil litigation moves slowly, especially when substantial assets are involved. We're probably looking at 18 months to 2 years before we reach a resolution, assuming it doesn't go to trial. If it does go to trial, add another year. 2 to 3 years of legal battles with Jessica. 2 to 3 years of depositions and court filings, and hostile confrontations mediated by attorneys. 2 to 3 years of having our family's private business dissected in public records and potentially reported in local newspapers if the amounts involved caught media attention. I thought about the Bridge Club ladies, about Margaret and the other widows who'd become my primary social circle since Harold's death. They'd been so impressed when I talked about Jessica's success, so envious that I had a daughter who was both accomplished and attentive to her mother's needs. What would they think when they learned that my perfect daughter had been systematically stealing from me for years? Mr. Reeves, is there any possibility of resolving this without going to court? Could we approach Jessica directly and demand repayment? We could try, but I wouldn't recommend it. Your daughter is a sophisticated attorney who now knows that you're aware of her activities. She's had several days to consult with colleagues, possibly to move assets beyond our reach, certainly to develop legal strategies for defending her actions. Any negotiation at this point would be conducted from a position of weakness. He leaned back in his chair, studying my face with the kind of professional compassion that comes from delivering bad news to vulnerable clients on a regular basis. Ellen, I need to be completely honest with you about something else. Even if we win this case, even if we recover a significant portion of your money, the legal fees and court costs are going to be substantial. I typically charge $400 an hour for litigation work, and a case this complex could easily require 500 billable hours. That's $200,000 in legal fees alone, not counting expert witnesses, court reporters, document processing, and other expenses. $200,000 to fight for money that Jessica had already taken from me. The irony was almost laughable if it wasn't so devastating. I'd need to spend a fortune I no longer had to recover the fortune my daughter had stolen. Do I have any choice? You could walk away. Accept that the money is gone, try to rebuild your financial security with whatever assets remain untouched, and maintain some kind of relationship with your daughter. How much is left untouched? Mr. Reeves consulted another document in the thick folder. Based on our analysis, approximately $300,000 in retirement accounts that couldn't be accessed through the power of attorney agreements, plus the equity in your house. Depending on the Portland real estate market, you're probably looking at total remaining assets of around $650,000. $650,000 out of the nearly $3 million Harold had left me. Jessica had managed to transfer or encumber almost 80% of my inheritance in 4 years, leaving me with barely enough to maintain my current lifestyle for another decade if I lived frugally. And if I walk away, she keeps everything she's taken? Everything. Plus, you remain liable for the loans she secured using your assets as collateral. Those debts don't disappear just because you choose not to pursue recovery. I signed the papers. Mr. Reeves filed the lawsuit on a Friday afternoon, which meant Jessica would be served with the summons on Monday morning. I spent the weekend in a strange state of suspended animation, knowing that by Tuesday, everything between us would be irrevocably changed, but unable to predict exactly what that change would look like. Margaret called on Sunday evening, her voice bubbling with excitement about some gossip she'd picked up at the grocery store. Ellen, you'll never believe what I heard at Safeway today. Betty Carmichael was talking to the pharmacist about her daughter-in-law's financial problems, and apparently the girl's been forging checks from her husband's business account to pay for gambling debts. Can you imagine? The poor man didn't know until his business partner called about bounced payments to suppliers. I made appropriate, sympathetic noises while mentally preparing for the day when my own family scandal would become grocery store gossip. Betty Carmichael's daughter-in-law had stolen thousands. Jessica had stolen millions. The scale of the betrayal would make for much juicier conversation among the widows of Southeast Portland. I feel so sorry for Betty, Margaret continued. She keeps saying she should have seen the signs, should have asked more questions about why her son seemed so stressed all the time. But honestly, how are we supposed to know when the people we trust are lying to us? How indeed? Jessica called me at 8:47 Monday evening, exactly 12 hours after being served with the lawsuit papers. Her voice was controlled, professional, the tone she used when representing clients in difficult negotiations. Mom, we need to talk. I think we've said everything we need to say, Jessica. No, we haven't, not even close. Do you have any idea what you've just done? Do you understand the legal and financial consequences of this lawsuit for both of us? I'd been expecting anger, tears, perhaps even threats. I hadn't been prepared for her to sound like a lawyer counseling a client who'd made a catastrophically bad decision. I understand that I'm trying to recover money that belongs to me. Money that was invested on your behalf with your full knowledge and authorization. Money that has generated substantial returns which have benefited you directly. Mom, you're not thinking clearly about this situation. The phrase, not thinking clearly, had become Jessica's go-to dismissal of my concerns. As if my age and grief had compromised my mental capacity to the point where my own perceptions couldn't be trusted. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in 4 years, Jessica. I'm thinking clearly enough to know that you've been lying to me, manipulating me, and stealing from me while pretending to protect my interests. Silence on the other end of the line. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted from professional to personal, taking on the hurt tone she'd perfected as a child when confronted with misbehavior. Mom, how can you say that to me? How can you accuse me of stealing when everything I've done has been motivated by love and concern for your welfare? I've spent countless hours managing your financial affairs, researching investment opportunities, structuring transactions to minimize tax liability. I've sacrificed time with my husband, time for my own career advancement, to make sure you were taken care of. By moving my money into your personal accounts? By consolidating assets for more efficient management? By leveraging your financial position to create investment opportunities that wouldn't have been available to smaller individual accounts? By using my professional expertise and business connections to generate returns that far exceeded what you would have earned through traditional savings and conservative investments. She was good. I had to give her that. Jessica had always been gifted at constructing plausible explanations for questionable behavior, at framing her self-interest as altruism, at making her victims feel guilty for questioning her motives. Jessica, I've seen the documents, I know about the shell companies, the loans secured with my assets, the investment returns paid directly to your personal accounts. I know about the debt you've created in my name without my knowledge or consent. Another pause, longer this time. When she continued, her voice had hardened. Mom, you're being manipulated by a lawyer who sees dollar signs when he looks at an elderly woman with substantial assets and family conflicts. This Thomas Reeves is going to charge you hundreds of thousands of dollars to pursue a case he can't win, and in the end, you'll have lost both your money and your daughter. I've already lost most of my money, Jessica. The question is whether I'm going to lose my dignity too by pretending I don't know what you've done. What I've done is turn your inheritance into a portfolio worth over $4. $2 million. What you're doing is destroying that portfolio by creating legal expenses and forcing liquidation of long-term investments at the worst possible time. $4.2 million. Even if that figure was accurate, which seemed unlikely given Jessica's demonstrated willingness to lie about financial matters, it didn't address the fundamental issue of consent and control. If that money exists, then you should be able to return it to accounts in my name without any difficulty. It's not that simple. The investments are structured as long-term holdings with significant penalties for early withdrawal. The business ventures require ongoing capital commitment. The tax implications of sudden asset restructuring could cost hundreds of thousands in penalties and lost benefits. Then we'll pay the penalties and restructuring costs. It's still my money, Jessica. It's our money, Mom, yours and mine. I'm your daughter, your primary beneficiary, your business partner in these ventures. When you die, everything reverts to me anyway, so the distinction between your assets and mine is largely academic. There it was. The truth Jessica had been dancing around for weeks, possibly for years. In her mind, Harold's legacy wasn't money she was managing for my benefit until my death. It was her inheritance that she was simply accessing a little early for convenience and efficiency. I'm not dead yet, Jessica. But you're 72 years old with a family history of heart disease and diabetes. Actuarial tables suggest you have maybe 15 years left, probably fewer if you continue to subject yourself to the stress of unnecessary legal battles. I felt something cold settle in my chest. My daughter was not just stealing from me, she was calculating how long I had left to live and planning accordingly. Jessica, I'm 62 years old. I'm in good health. I could live another 25 years. Silence. Then, quietly, you told me you were 72. I never told you I was 72. I'm 62. I was born in 1961. More silence. Longer this time. When Jessica spoke again, her voice was different, uncertain in a way I hadn't heard since she was a teenager caught in a lie. I thought you were older. You've seemed so fragile since Dad died. So confused about financial matters, so dependent on my help. Or maybe you needed to believe I was older and more fragile than I actually am to justify what you've been doing. Mom, this conversation isn't productive. We need to sit down with our respective attorneys and work out a resolution that protects both of our interests. My attorney and I will be happy to meet with you and your counsel to discuss the return of my assets. This lawsuit is going to destroy our relationship permanently. Jessica, you destroyed our relationship when you decided to treat me like a convenient source of funding for your business ventures instead of your mother. I hung up before she could respond. The next morning brought a call from Mr. Reeves with news that Jessica had already retained counsel and filed a motion to dismiss our lawsuit. She's hired Patricia Whitman, he said, and something in his tone suggested this was significant. Should I know that name? Patricia Whitman is one of the top estate litigation attorneys in the Northwest. She typically charges $650 an hour and specializes in defending challenges to financial guardianships and powers of attorney. Your daughter is taking this very seriously. What does the motion to dismiss argue? That you granted her broad discretionary authority to manage your assets, that all transactions were conducted within the scope of that authority, and that you lack standing to challenge investment decisions you specifically authorized her to make on your behalf. I felt my stomach drop. Is she right? Technically, some of her argument has merit. The power of attorney documents you signed were very broadly written, and Jessica was careful to structure many of her transactions in ways that could be interpreted as legitimate asset management. But there are still substantial problems with her defense. What kind of problems? The shell companies, the personal loans secured with your assets, the investment returns diverted to her personal accounts. Even broad discretionary authority doesn't typically extend to self-dealing on that scale. But she might win? Mr. Reeves was quiet for a moment. Ellen, I need to be honest with you. This case just became much more expensive and much more uncertain. Patricia Whitman doesn't take cases she doesn't think she can win. And she doesn't come cheap. Your daughter is prepared to spend serious money defending herself, which suggests she has serious money to spend. Money she stole from me, possibly, or money she earned through the investments she made with your assets. The line between theft and aggressive asset management isn't always clear in cases like this. I thought about Jessica's claim that she'd grown my inheritance to $4. $2 million. If that was true, and if she could demonstrate that her unconventional management strategies had generated substantial returns, a judge might be inclined to view her actions as financially beneficial regardless of the methods used. What do we do now? We respond to the motion to dismiss. We continue with discovery, and we prepare for a much longer and more complex legal battle than I initially anticipated. And the costs are going to be substantially higher than my original estimate. With Patricia Whitman involved, we're looking at extensive depositions, expert witness testimony, forensic accounting analysis. I'd estimate total litigation costs of at least $400,000, possibly more. $400,000. More than half of my remaining assets, just to fight for the return of money that had already been taken from me. The mathematics of justice were becoming increasingly depressing. That afternoon, Margaret called with more gossip, but this time the subject wasn't Betty Carmichael's daughter-in-law. Ellen, I don't know if you've heard, but there are rumors going around about Jessica. Something about financial problems, legal troubles. Betty mentioned she saw something filed in the court records, a lawsuit involving your family name. I'd known this was coming, but it still felt like a physical blow to have my private family crisis become public entertainment for the bridge club gossips. It's a complicated situation, Margaret. Oh, honey, I'm not trying to pry. I just wanted you to know that people are talking, and I wanted to make sure you have support if you need it. What exactly are people saying? Margaret hesitated. Well, Betty's daughter works at the courthouse, and she mentioned seeing paperwork about financial elder abuse. People are wondering if Jessica's been taking advantage of you financially. Financial elder abuse. The clinical term for what Jessica had been doing to me made it sound like a crime committed by strangers against vulnerable seniors, not a betrayal by a beloved child against a trusting parent. Margaret, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not ready to discuss the details of the situation. Of course. I just want you to know that whatever's happening, you don't have to face it alone. We're all here for you. After hanging up, I sat in Harold's chair and tried to imagine what the next 2 years of my life were going to look like. Legal depositions and court hearings and motions and appeals. Newspaper coverage and gossip and speculation about my family's private business. Mounting legal bills and declining assets, and the constant stress of combat with the daughter I'd raised to be honest and ethical. The photo albums were still scattered around the den from the night Jessica had found me reviewing financial documents. Pictures of her childhood, her achievements, her wedding to David. Images of a family that had seemed solid and loving and normal just a few weeks earlier. I picked up a photograph from Jessica's law school graduation. She was wearing her cap and gown, diploma in hand, smiling that confident smile I'd been so proud of. Harold and I flanked her on either side, both of us beaming with parental pride at what our daughter had accomplished. Looking at that picture now, I wondered if Jessica's ethical corruption had already begun by then, or if it had developed gradually over the years as she gained more experience with financial manipulation and legal loopholes. Had she always been capable of betraying people who trusted her, or had success and opportunity gradually eroded whatever moral foundation Harold and I had tried to build? The phone rang again. Jessica, according to the caller ID. I let it go to voicemail. The message she left was different from her previous calls, less controlled, more emotional. Mom, please call me back. I know you're angry, and I know you feel betrayed, but we can work this out. We don't need lawyers and lawsuits and courtrooms. We're family. We're all we have left of Dad's legacy. Don't let some stranger destroy what we mean to each other over money that's ultimately going to be mine anyway when you're gone. I listened to the message 3 times, analyzing the mixture of manipulation and genuine emotion in Jessica's voice. She was scared, which was new. She was also still trying to frame the conflict as a misunderstanding that could be resolved through family loyalty rather than legal accountability. But what struck me most was her repeated reference to Harold's legacy. In Jessica's mind, the money he'd worked his entire career to accumulate for my security was primarily significant as her eventual inheritance. My intervening years of life and financial need were just an inconvenience to be managed until the natural transfer of wealth could occur. I called Mr. Reeves at home. Ellen, is everything all right? I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. If we pursue this case and somehow win, if we recover the money and hold Jessica accountable for what she's done, what are the chances that she'll ever forgive me? What are the chances that we'll ever have a normal mother-daughter relationship again? Mr. Reeves was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Ellen, in my experience, family financial disputes change relationships permanently. Even when they're resolved favorably, even when the money is recovered, the underlying betrayal of trust is very difficult to repair. So I'm choosing between financial security and having a daughter. You're choosing between being a victim and being empowered. Your daughter made the choice that destroyed your relationship when she decided to steal from you. You're just choosing how to respond to that reality. And if I drop the lawsuit, if I walk away and let her keep what she's taken, then you'll spend the rest of your life knowing that you were robbed by someone you loved, and she'll spend the rest of hers knowing she got away with it. That's not a foundation for a healthy relationship either. I hung up and sat in the growing darkness of my den, surrounded by photo albums and financial documents and the ruins of everything I'd believed about my family. Tomorrow, I would have to decide whether to continue the legal battle that might recover my money but would certainly cost me my daughter. Or I could surrender, accept the theft, and try to rebuild some kind of relationship with a person who had demonstrated that she saw me primarily as a source of funding for her ambitions. Neither option offered the possibility of getting back what I'd really lost: the daughter I thought I had raised, the family I thought we had been, the trust that had made love possible between us. But sitting there in Harold's chair, I realized that maybe the stories I'd tried to tell Jessica over the years had a different kind of value than I'd understood. They weren't just entertainment or family history. They were examples of women who had faced impossible choices and found the strength to choose dignity over comfort, principle over convenience. Great-grandmother hadn't just survived the Great Depression by knitting scarves. She'd survived by refusing to be dependent on people who didn't value her contributions. She'd built her own business rather than accepting charity from relatives who saw her as a burden. Maybe it was time for me to stop trying to maintain a relationship based on lies and start building a life based on truth, even if that truth was more lonely and more expensive than the comfortable deception I'd been living. The lawsuit would continue. The forensic accountant arrived at my house on a Tuesday morning that felt like the beginning of the end of everything I'd believed about privacy and family dignity. Caroline Webb was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes behind designer glasses and the kind of efficient energy that suggested she'd seen every possible variation of financial deception during her 15-year career investigating white-collar fraud. "Mrs. Morrison, I'll need access to every financial document you have from the past 6 years," she explained, while setting up her laptop on Harold's old desk. "Bank statements, tax returns, insurance policies, investment records, loan applications, everything, even documents that seem irrelevant to your current situation." I'd spent the previous week gathering papers from file cabinets I hadn't opened since Harold's death, sorting through boxes of receipts and statements that represented the mundane details of a 35-year marriage and 4 years of widowhood. Looking at them spread across my dining room table, I was struck by how much of a life could be reduced to carbon copies and monthly summaries. "Some of these records are quite old," I said, watching Caroline organize documents into neat stacks based on criteria I didn't understand. "Harold kept everything, but I'm not sure what's actually important. In financial fraud cases, everything is potentially important. Patterns often emerge over time, sometimes going back years before the actual theft begins. We need to establish baseline behavior, normal transaction patterns, legitimate transfers versus suspicious activity." She pulled out a document that made my chest tighten. The original power of attorney agreement I'd signed 6 months after Harold's funeral, when I was still crying every morning and could barely manage to pay the electric bill without his guidance. "This is quite comprehensive," Caroline observed, studying the legal language that I'd never bothered to read carefully. "Your daughter was granted authority to make investment decisions, access accounts, sign contracts on your behalf, even establish new business entities using your assets." Jessica said it was standard language for estate management. She said it would allow her to handle routine financial matters without bothering me for signatures on every minor transaction. Caroline made notes on a yellow pad, her expression neutral but focused. "The language is broader than typical for standard estate management. This document essentially made your daughter your financial alter ego, with almost unlimited authority to make decisions about your money. Was that a mistake? It depends on whether you trusted her to use that authority solely for your benefit rather than her own." I watched Caroline work, methodically entering data into spreadsheets that would eventually tell the complete story of Jessica's systematic appropriation of my inheritance. Each entry represented another small betrayal, another instance of my daughter choosing her financial advantage over my security and trust. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm seeing some unusual patterns in your account activity starting about 18 months after your husband's death. Large transfers to newly established business accounts, substantial investments in ventures that don't appear to generate income for your benefit, loan applications signed with your authorization but using funds for purposes that seem unrelated to your personal financial needs. Can you be more specific?" Caroline turned her laptop screen toward me, showing a timeline of transactions that looked like a medical chart documenting the progression of a terminal illness. Each spike in the graph represented thousands of dollars moved from my accounts into Jessica's expanding financial empire. In month 18, $147,000 was transferred to something called Pacific Northwest Investment Solutions. The company was incorporated by your daughter 3 weeks before the transfer, using your home address as the corporate headquarters. The stated business purpose was real estate development, but I can't find any evidence of property purchases or development activity. What happened to the money? Based on the available records, most of it was transferred to a second shell company called Morrison Financial Services, which then used the funds to secure a business loan for $300,000. The loan proceeds were deposited into your daughter's personal checking account. I stared at the screen, trying to process the mechanics of how Jessica had transformed my inheritance into her personal spending money through a maze of corporate entities and loan applications. The sophistication of the scheme was breathtaking, requiring knowledge of business law, corporate finance, and accounting principles that went far beyond simple theft. She created fake companies just to steal from me? The companies aren't fake in the legal sense. They're properly incorporated entities with legitimate business registrations. But they appear to exist solely to facilitate the movement of your assets into accounts controlled by your daughter. Caroline clicked through screen after screen of financial records, revealing a pattern of increasingly complex transactions that had systematically stripped away my security over the course of 3 years. Shell companies, business loans, investment partnerships, real estate ventures, consulting contracts. Jessica had built an entire corporate ecosystem designed to convert my inheritance into her personal wealth while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business activity. How much money are we talking about in total? Caroline consulted her spreadsheet, double-checking figures that seemed to grow larger every time she calculated them. Based on my analysis so far, approximately $2.7 million has been moved from accounts under your control to entities controlled or substantially benefited by your daughter. $2.7 million. Nearly 90% of what Harold had left me vanished into Jessica's labyrinthine financial schemes while I'd been telling myself that she was just helping me manage complicated investments. And the business loan liabilities I mentioned? Those are more complex. Your daughter used your assets as collateral to secure loans totaling $1 million. But the loan proceeds weren't used for investments that benefit you. Instead, they appear to have funded her lifestyle, her divorce proceedings, and additional business ventures that generate income paid directly to her personal accounts. The doorbell rang, interrupting Carolyn's devastating financial autopsy. I looked through the peephole to see David Chen standing on my front porch, looking nervous and carrying what appeared to be a banker's box filled with documents. "David," I said, opening the door with surprise. "What brings you here?" "Mrs. Morrison, I need to talk to you about Jessica." "About the divorce? About the financial situation? About things I should have told you months ago but didn't, because I thought it wasn't my place to interfere between a mother and daughter." I led him into the living room, away from Caroline's forensic accounting operation in the dining room. David looked exhausted, like he'd been losing sleep for weeks, and there was something in his expression that reminded me of a man preparing to confess sins that had been weighing on his conscience. "David, what's going on? What do you need to tell me?" He set the box down on my coffee table with the careful precision of someone handling evidence in a criminal investigation. "These are financial records from our marriage. Bank statements, credit card bills, investment account summaries, loan applications. Everything Jessica told me not to worry about because she was handling all our financial planning." "I don't understand. Why are you showing me your marriage financial records?" "Because your money funded most of our lifestyle for the past 2 years. The house we bought, the cars we drove, the vacations we took, the expensive restaurants and designer clothes and country club memberships. It was all paid for with transfers from accounts that Jessica said were her inheritance from your husband." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "She told you the money came from Harold's estate? She said you'd given her early access to her inheritance because you wanted to simplify your estate planning? She said you were happy to see her enjoying the money while she was young rather than waiting until after your death." I never gave Jessica early access to anything. I didn't even know she was accessing my accounts until a few weeks ago. David's face went pale. "Mrs. Morrison, if that's true, then I've been living off stolen money for years without knowing it." I studied his expression, trying to determine whether his shock was genuine or performative. David had always seemed like an honest person, quiet and straightforward in a way that contrasted sharply with Jessica's calculating intensity. But he'd also been married to my daughter for 18 months, presumably sharing financial information and making joint decisions about major purchases. "David, are you telling me that you had no idea Jessica was taking money from my accounts without my knowledge or permission?" "I knew she had access to family money, and I knew she was making substantial transfers to cover our expenses. But she told me everything was legitimate, that she was managing investments on your behalf and taking a reasonable management fee for her services." "A management fee?" David opened the box and pulled out a manila folder filled with bank statements from a joint account I'd never heard of. "Jessica created this account about 6 months after we were married. She called it her financial management consulting fee, money she earned for handling your complex investment portfolio. He handed me the statements, and I saw monthly deposits ranging from $15,000 to $35,000, all coming from accounts that bore my name and social security number. Over 18 months, Jessica had paid herself nearly $500,000 in consulting fees for managing money she'd stolen from me. David, did you ever question these consulting fees? Did you ever ask to see documentation of the services Jessica was providing to justify this level of compensation? I asked once, early in our marriage, and Jessica said the work was highly technical, involving tax optimization and investment analysis that required specialized knowledge. She said the fees were comparable to what professional wealth managers charge for similar services. But you never saw any actual documentation of this investment analysis? David looked down at his hands. Jessica handled all our financial planning. She said it was more efficient for one person to manage everything, rather than trying to involve me in decisions that required expertise I didn't have. I was beginning to understand how Jessica had managed to conduct such an extensive theft operation without detection. She'd compartmentalized her deception, telling me that she was handling routine estate management while telling David that she was earning legitimate fees for professional financial services. Neither of us had seen the complete picture of what she was actually doing. David, why are you telling me this now? Why are you bringing me these records? Because I found out about the lawsuit, and I realized that if you're suing Jessica for financial theft, then everything we built together was probably built on money that didn't belong to us. He paused, struggling with something that seemed to be causing him genuine emotional distress. Mrs. Morrison, I loved your daughter. I thought I was marrying someone honest and ethical. But the woman I've been living with for the past year isn't the person I fell in love with. What do you mean? The lies, the manipulation, the way she talks about you when you're not around. Jessica has been telling me for months that you're becoming mentally unstable, that you're making irrational demands on her time and emotional energy, that she's considering having you evaluated for competency issues. I felt my breath catch. Competency issues. She said you were calling her at all hours with paranoid concerns about your finances, that you were forgetting conversations you'd had about investment decisions, that you were showing signs of age-related, cognitive decline that might require legal intervention. David, I haven't called Jessica at all hours about anything. Our conversations have been brief and infrequent, usually initiated by her when she needed me to sign papers. That's what I'm starting to realize. And there are other things, financial things, that don't make sense if Jessica was really trying to protect your interests. Caroline appeared in the doorway between the dining room and living room, her expression grave. Mrs. Morrison, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think Mr. Chen should hear what I've discovered in my analysis. David looked confused. Who is this? David, this is Caroline Webb. She's a forensic accountant who's been analyzing my financial records to document what Jessica has done with my money. Caroline sat down across from David, her laptop open to a spreadsheet that showed the complex web of transactions connecting my depleted accounts to Jessica's expanding wealth. Mr. Chen, based on the records Mrs. Morrison has provided, your wife has been systematically transferring funds from her mother's accounts to business entities she controls, then using those entities to generate income that benefits her directly rather than her mother. David stared at the spreadsheet, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding to what looked like genuine horror. How much money? Nearly $3 million over the past 4 years. Jesus Christ. David put his head in his hands. Mrs. Morrison, I had no idea. I swear to you, I had no idea the scope of what Jessica was doing. But you knew she was accessing my accounts? I knew she was managing your investments and taking fees for her services. But I thought the fees were proportionate to legitimate services, and I thought the investment management was authorized by you. Caroline consulted her notes. Mr. Chen, some of the loan applications I've reviewed list you as a co-borrower on debts secured by Mrs. Morrison's assets. Did you knowingly apply for loans using your mother-in-law's property as collateral? David looked up sharply. What loan applications? Caroline turned her laptop screen toward him, showing documents that bore both his and Jessica's signatures. These 3 business loans, totaling $600,000, were secured using Mrs. Morrison's house and retirement accounts as collateral. Your signature appears on all the applications. David studied the documents, his face growing increasingly pale. I never signed these. I've never seen these applications before. The signatures appear to match samples of your handwriting from other documents. Because Jessica forged them. She has samples of my signature from our joint bank accounts, our mortgage application, our marriage license. She could easily forge my signature on loan documents if she needed a co-borrower to qualify for larger amounts. I watched this exchange with growing amazement at the complexity of Jessica's deception. She hadn't just stolen from me, she'd also committed identity theft against her own husband, forging his signature on loan applications that put my assets at risk for debts he'd never agreed to assume. David, are there other instances where Jessica might have used your identity without your knowledge? Probably. She handled all our financial paperwork, all our insurance applications, all our business filings. I signed documents when she asked me to, usually without reading them carefully because I trusted her to handle the details. Caroline made more notes, adding David's potential victimization to the growing list of Jessica's fraudulent activities. Mr. Chen, I'd recommend that you contact your own attorney and consider filing a police report about the forged signatures. Identity theft is a criminal offense separate from the civil issues Mrs. Morrison is pursuing. I can't file criminal charges against my own wife. You can, and you should, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. David, Jessica has been lying to both of us for years. She's stolen from me, she's forged your signature, and she's put both of us at financial risk to fund her personal ambitions. This isn't about family loyalty anymore. This is about criminal behavior. David looked at me with something that might have been gratitude. Mrs. Morrison, I want to help you recover your money. I want to testify about what Jessica told me, about the consulting fees, about her plans to have you declared incompetent. I want to do whatever I can to make this right. That's very generous, David, but I don't want to put you in the middle of this legal battle. I'm already in the middle of it. Jessica used my identity to commit fraud, used my marriage to her as cover for financial crimes, used my ignorance as protection against questions about her activities. The least I can do is help expose the truth about what she's been doing. Caroline closed her laptop and gathered her papers. Mrs. Morrison, I have enough information to prepare a comprehensive report for your attorney. The pattern of financial manipulation is clear. The amounts involved are substantial, and with Mr. Chen's cooperation, we can document the deceptive practices Jessica used to conceal her activities from both of you. After Caroline left, David and I sat in my living room talking about the marriage he thought he'd been living and the daughter I thought I'd raised. Two people who'd been manipulated by someone we'd both loved and trusted, discovering that our perceptions of reality had been carefully constructed lies designed to facilitate systematic theft. Mrs. Morrison, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you think Jessica was always capable of this kind of deception, or do you think something changed her over the years? I had been asking myself the same question since discovering the extent of Jessica's financial crimes. Had I raised a daughter who was inherently dishonest and manipulative? Or had success and opportunity corrupted someone who'd started with better intentions? I keep thinking about her childhood, looking for signs I might have missed. But honestly, David, the girl I raised wouldn't have been capable of what we've discovered. She was competitive, ambitious, sometimes ruthless in pursuing her goals. But I never saw evidence of the kind of calculated cruelty required to systematically steal from your own mother. So what happened to her? I think she started believing that she was entitled to my money because she was smart enough to make it grow faster than I could. She convinced herself that taking it early was actually doing me a favor, that she was a better steward of Harold's legacy than I could ever be. David nodded slowly. That sounds like the Jessica I've been living with. She has this way of reframing selfish behavior as altruism, of making herself the hero in every story even when she's clearly the villain. The tragedy is that she didn't need to steal from me. Jessica was already successful, already earning substantial income from her law practice. If she'd just asked for help with business investments or major purchases, I probably would have been happy to provide it. But asking would have meant acknowledging that the money belonged to you rather than her. Exactly. And it would have meant accepting some oversight of how the money was used, some accountability for the results. My phone rang, interrupting our conversation. Mr. Reeves, calling with an update on the legal proceedings that I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. Ellen, I have some significant developments to report. Patricia Whitman has filed a countersuit against you, claiming that your lawsuit is frivolous and motivated by mental incompetence rather than legitimate financial grievances. Mental incompetence? She's arguing that you're suffering from age-related cognitive decline that prevents you from understanding the investment decisions you previously authorized Jessica to make on your behalf. I felt rage building in my chest. Not only was Jessica stealing from me and lying about it, but now she was trying to have me declared mentally incompetent to avoid accountability for her crimes. Mr. Reeves, I'm 62 years old, I'm in good health, and I'm perfectly capable of understanding that my daughter has been robbing me blind for 4 years. I know that, and we'll be able to demonstrate it, but the countersuit complicates our case and adds another layer of legal expense. Patricia Whitman is demanding that you undergo psychological evaluation to determine your competency to manage your own financial affairs. And if I refuse? Then she'll argue that your refusal demonstrates awareness of your diminished capacity. It's a classic legal trap. David had been listening to my side of the conversation, and he reached over to touch my arm gently. Mrs. Morrison, tell your lawyer that I'll testify about Jessica's plans to have you declared incompetent. Tell him I have documentation of her discussing legal strategies for gaining full control of your finances. I relayed David's offer to Mr. Reeves, who sounded interested but cautious. That could be very helpful, but we need to be careful about spousal privilege issues. David's marriage to Jessica might limit what testimony he can provide. They're separated and filing for divorce. That helps, but there are still complications. We'll need to research the specific limitations on spousal testimony and financial fraud cases. After hanging up, I looked at David with a mixture of gratitude and concern. Are you sure you want to get involved in this legal battle? Jessica isn't going to forgive you for testifying against her. Mrs. Morrison, my marriage to Jessica is over, regardless of what happens with this lawsuit. But my conscience won't be clear until I've done everything I can to help you recover what she's stolen. We spent the rest of the afternoon going through the financial documents David had brought, identifying transactions that demonstrated Jessica's pattern of deception. Each bank statement told part of the story, but together they revealed a comprehensive scheme that had systematically transferred my wealth into Jessica's control, while maintaining the appearance of legitimate estate management. David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Of course. During your marriage to Jessica, did you ever suspect that something wasn't right about her financial activities? Even if you didn't understand the details, did you have any gut feelings that she might be deceiving you? David was quiet for a long time, staring at the bank statements spread across my coffee table. There were moments, he said finally, times when her explanations for large purchases or major financial decisions didn't quite make sense. Times when she seemed evasive about specific details or defensive about questions that should have been routine. Why didn't you push for better answers? Because I loved her, and because she was so much more sophisticated about financial matters than I was. When someone you trust tells you that your questions demonstrate ignorance about complex subjects, you tend to accept their expertise rather than challenging their authority. That's exactly what she did to me. Made me feel stupid for asking questions about my own money. It's a form of emotional manipulation that's very effective with people who want to maintain trust in someone they love. That evening, after David left with promises to provide whatever testimony might be helpful for my case, I sat in Harold's chair and tried to process everything I'd learned. Jessica had stolen nearly $3 million from me, forged her husband's signature on loan applications, created shell companies to hide her theft, and was now trying to have me declared mentally incompetent to avoid accountability for her crimes. The daughter I'd raised was gone, replaced by a sophisticated criminal who happened to share her DNA and childhood memories. But I was no longer the confused and trusting widow who'd signed papers without reading them. I was becoming someone Harold would have been proud of, someone who fought back when attacked, someone who refused to be victimized by people who mistook kindness for weakness. Margaret called around 8 o'clock, ostensibly to check on my well-being, but obviously. Potential consequences of this lawsuit for your relationship with your daughter? Heartbroken, I said honestly, but clear about the necessity. Jessica made choices that destroyed our relationship when she decided to steal from me. I'm just making choices about how to respond to that reality. Dr. Martinez made notes throughout our conversation, occasionally asking follow-up questions that seemed designed to test the consistency of my responses and the depth of my understanding. Mrs. Morrison, some people might argue that family financial disputes should be resolved privately rather than through litigation. How do you respond to that perspective? I would have been happy to resolve this privately if Jessica had been honest about what she'd done and willing to return the money she'd taken. But she's continued lying, created additional shell companies to hide assets, and is now trying to have me declared incompetent to avoid accountability. At that point, private resolution becomes impossible. The psychological evaluation was submitted to the court 3 weeks later, and Mr. Reeves called me with results that made Jessica's competency challenge backfire spectacularly. Ellen, Dr. Martinez's report is devastating to your daughter's case. She found no evidence of cognitive impairment, no signs of diminished capacity, and specifically noted that your decision to pursue legal action demonstrates sophisticated understanding of complex financial matters and sound judgment about protecting your interests. What did she say about Jessica's claims that I was mentally unstable? She addressed that directly. Dr. Martinez wrote that your daughter's allegations appear to be tactical rather than genuine, designed to discredit your testimony rather than reflecting actual concerns about your well-being. The forensic accounting report was equally damaging to Jessica's defense. Caroline had traced every dollar, documented every shell company, and created a timeline that showed Jessica's systematic appropriation of my assets with scientific precision. The evidence was so comprehensive that Patricia Whitman filed a motion requesting additional time to prepare her client's response. But Jessica wasn't finished fighting. 3 days after Dr. Martinez's report was submitted, she filed criminal charges against David for identity theft, claiming he had forged her signature on divorce papers and fraudulently accessed their joint bank accounts. David called me in tears. Mrs. Morrison, she's having me arrested for crimes she committed. The police showed up at my apartment this morning with a warrant based on Jessica's sworn statement that I've been stealing from her. David, we have bank records showing that Jessica forged your signature on loan applications. We have documentation of her lies about the consulting fees. Surely the police can see through her accusations. The detectives said they have to investigate all claims of financial fraud, regardless of whether there are competing allegations. I've been charged with identity theft and grand larceny. My trial date is set for next month. I realized that Jessica was using criminal charges against David as leverage in our civil case. If she could have him convicted of financial crimes, his testimony about her activities would be discredited as the accusations of a convicted felon seeking revenge against his ex-wife. Mr. Reeves confirmed my suspicions when I called to discuss this latest development. This is a sophisticated legal strategy, Ellen. Jessica's trying to neutralize our most important witness by having him branded as a criminal. If David is convicted, his credibility as a witness in our case becomes seriously compromised. What can we do? We can provide David's attorney with our evidence documenting Jessica's forgery of his signature. We can offer expert testimony about the pattern of financial manipulation. But ultimately, David's criminal case is separate from our civil lawsuit, and we can't control the outcome. That afternoon, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called Patricia Whitman's office directly and requested a meeting. Mrs. Morrison, I'm not sure it's fishing for information about the rumors circulating through our social circle. Ellen, honey, I ran into Betty at the grocery store again, and she mentioned that there's been quite a bit of legal activity involving your family. Are you doing all right? I'm fine, Margaret. Just dealing with some complex financial issues that require professional help. Is there anything we can do to support you? The Bridge Club ladies are all concerned about you. I appreciate that, but this is something I need to handle myself. After hanging up, I realized that Margaret's call represented something important. My social circle was watching how I handled this crisis, and their perception of me would be shaped by whether I emerged from it as a victim who'd been taken advantage of by a dishonest daughter, or as a strong woman who'd fought back against financial abuse and won. The stories I'd tried to tell Jessica about our family's history of resilient women weren't just entertaining anecdotes. They were examples of how to respond when life presented impossible choices between dignity and security, between family loyalty and personal integrity. Great-grandmother hadn't just survived the Great Depression by knitting scarves. She'd survived by refusing to let circumstances or other people's expectations define her options. She'd created her own solutions to problems that seemed insurmountable, and she'd built a legacy of strength that had been passed down through generations of women who'd faced their own impossible situations. It was time for me to add my own chapter to that legacy. The psychological evaluation took place on a cold February morning in a sterile office that smelled like disinfectant and disappointment. Dr. Rachel Martinez was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with kind eyes that seemed genuinely interested in understanding rather than judging. She'd been recommended by Mr. Reeves as someone who specialized in competency assessments for older adults and had experience testifying in financial exploitation cases. "Mrs. Morrison, I understand this evaluation wasn't your choice," Dr. Martinez said as I settled into a comfortable chair across from her desk. "The court has ordered this assessment as part of the legal proceedings involving your financial affairs. My job is to determine your cognitive capacity to make informed decisions about complex financial matters." I'd been dreading this appointment for weeks, knowing that Jessica's attorney would use any sign of confusion or uncertainty as evidence that I was incompetent to challenge my daughter's management of my assets. But sitting across from Dr. Martinez, I felt calmer than I'd expected. "Doctor, I want you to know that I requested this evaluation be recorded and that my attorney receives a complete transcript. I have nothing to hide about my mental capacity." Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly. "That's actually a good sign, Mrs. Morrison. People with genuine cognitive impairment rarely have that level of insight into legal proceedings or concern about documentation." The evaluation lasted 4 hours and covered everything from basic memory tests to complex problem-solving scenarios. Dr. Martinez asked me to explain financial concepts, analyze hypothetical investment decisions, and describe the timeline of events that had led to my lawsuit against Jessica. She tested my ability to perform mathematical calculations, remember sequences of information, and maintain logical reasoning under pressure. "Mrs. Morrison, can you walk me through your decision-making process when you chose to hire an attorney to investigate your daughter's financial activities?" I explained how David's suggestion about getting independent legal advice had planted the seed of doubt, how Mr. Reeves' initial analysis had revealed troubling patterns in my account activity, and how Caroline's forensic investigation had documented the scope of Jessica's theft. I described my thought process, my emotional reactions, and my reasoning for deciding that legal action was necessary despite the personal cost. "And how do you feel about the appropriate for us to meet without your attorney present?" Patricia said when her secretary connected our call. "Then let's include both attorneys. But I want to make an offer to resolve this matter without further litigation." The meeting took place in Patricia Whitman's conference room, with enough legal firepower present to staff a small law firm. Patricia, Jessica, and 2 associate attorneys on one side of the polished table, Mr. Reeves, Caroline, and myself on the other. The atmosphere was so tense, I could practically hear everyone's heartbeats. "Mrs. Morrison," Patricia began, "my client has authorized me to listen to any reasonable settlement proposal, but we want to be clear that Jessica maintains her innocence regarding your allegations of financial impropriety." I looked directly at Jessica, who was dressed in a conservative business suit and wearing the composed expression she'd perfected for court appearances. She looked successful, competent, completely unlike someone who'd spent 4 years systematically stealing from her mother. "Jessica, I'm going to offer you one chance to resolve this honestly. Return every dollar you've taken from my accounts, transfer ownership of all shell companies back to me, and pay the legal fees I've incurred to discover your theft. In exchange, I'll drop the civil lawsuit and won't pursue criminal charges for fraud and identity theft." Jessica exchanged glances with Patricia before responding. "Mom, you're asking me to admit to crimes I didn't commit and pay penalties for legitimate business activities. That's not a settlement offer, that's extortion. It's accountability, Jessica. Something you've been avoiding for 4 years. I've been managing your financial affairs competently and profitably. The investments I've made on your behalf have generated substantial returns that have benefited both of us." I pulled out Caroline's forensic report and placed it on the conference table between us. "According to this analysis, you've stolen $2. $7 million from me, created fraudulent shell companies to hide the theft, forged David's signature on loan applications, and tried to have me declared mentally incompetent to avoid accountability. Those aren't investment management activities, Jessica, they're criminal activities. Patricia leaned forward. Mrs. Morrison, these are serious allegations that my client disputes. The activities you're describing were authorized by comprehensive power of attorney agreements that you signed voluntarily. Power of attorney doesn't authorize theft, and it doesn't authorize forgery, and it certainly doesn't authorize using my assets to secure loans that benefit Jessica rather than me. Jessica finally spoke, her voice carrying the cold authority she'd developed in her legal career. Mom, you're 62 years old, you live alone, and you have no experience managing complex financial portfolios. Everything I've done has been designed to protect your assets and ensure your financial security. By stealing from me? By investing your money professionally instead of letting it sit in savings accounts earning minimal interest while inflation eroded its value. In shell companies that you control and that generate income paid to your personal accounts? Jessica's composure slipped slightly. The corporate structures are legitimate business entities designed to optimize tax efficiency and investment returns. For whom, Jessica? For me or for you? Patricia intervened before Jessica could respond. Mrs. Morrison, we're prepared to offer a compromise. Jessica will restructure the investment entities to provide more transparency about returns and management fees. She'll also establish a monthly income stream that ensures your financial security for life. And the $7 million she's already stolen? The funds that have been invested in business ventures that couldn't be liquidated without substantial losses to both parties. I stood up, suddenly exhausted by the elaborate lies and legal maneuvering designed to avoid simple acknowledgement of theft. Patricia, Jessica, I came here hoping my daughter would finally tell the truth and make this right. Instead, she's continuing to lie, continuing to manipulate, and continuing to treat me like an obstacle to her personal enrichment, rather than the mother who raised her and trusted her. I picked up my purse and looked directly at Jessica one last time. I'll see you in court. The trial began 6 months later on a bright spring morning that felt like the beginning of something new rather than the end of something precious. The courthouse steps were crowded with attorneys, reporters, and curious spectators drawn by a case that had generated local media attention as an example of financial elder abuse by trusted family members. David's criminal trial had concluded 2 months earlier with his complete vindication. The prosecutor had dropped all charges after reviewing our evidence of Jessica's forgery and financial manipulation, and David's testimony in our civil case would now carry the credibility of someone who'd been falsely accused, rather than the taint of criminal conviction. Mr. Reeves had prepared meticulously, organizing our evidence into a compelling narrative of systematic theft disguised as investment management. Caroline's forensic analysis provided the foundation, David's testimony revealed the deception, and Dr. Martinez's psychological evaluation demolished Jessica's claims about my mental incompetence. Jessica's defense team had clearly anticipated a difficult case. Patricia Whitman had brought 3 associate attorneys, 2 expert witnesses, and boxes of documents designed to support their argument that Jessica's activities were legitimate asset management rather than theft. The trial lasted 2 weeks, with testimony from bankers, investment advisors, forensic accountants, and family members who testified about Jessica's character and my mental capacity. The judge, an experienced woman in her 60s who'd presumably seen every variation of family financial dispute during her career, listened with attention that suggested she understood the human cost of the legal technicalities being debated. On the final day of testimony, I took the witness stand to tell my own story. Not the story of complex financial transactions and corporate shell games, but the story of a mother who'd trusted her daughter completely and discovered that trust had been systematically betrayed for years. Mrs. Morrison, Mr. Reeves asked, "Can you describe your relationship with your daughter before you discovered her financial activities?" I loved Jessica unconditionally. I was proud of her success, grateful for her help managing complicated financial matters, and completely trusting of her judgment about investments and business decisions. And how do you feel about that relationship now? I looked across the courtroom at Jessica, who was sitting at the defense table looking composed and professional, despite the devastating testimony that had been presented against her over the past 2 weeks. Heartbroken, not just because of the money she stole, but because of the lies she told to justify it. The daughter I raised would have been horrified by what she's done. The woman sitting at that table is a stranger who happens to share Jessica's DNA. Patricia Whitman's cross-examination focused on my age, my emotional state since Harold's death, and my lack of sophistication about financial matters. She suggested that I was motivated by jealousy of Jessica's success and resentment about being excluded from business decisions that required expertise I didn't possess. Mrs. Morrison, isn't it true that you've always been dependent on others to handle your financial affairs? First your husband, then your daughter. It's true that I relied on people I trusted to help me understand complex financial matters, but I never relinquished my right to know how my money was being used or to approve major decisions about my assets. And isn't it true that the investment strategies your daughter implemented have been financially successful? Some of Jessica's investments may have generated profits, but they were made without my knowledge or consent, using money she'd stolen from my accounts. Success doesn't justify theft. The judge's ruling came 2 days later. She found in my favor on every major claim, ordering Jessica to return $2, $1 million in stolen assets, plus interest and legal fees. The written opinion was a scathing indictment of Jessica's conduct, describing her activities as a sophisticated scheme of financial elder abuse disguised as investment management. Jessica's law license was suspended pending investigation by the State Bar Association. The shell companies were dissolved, their assets transferred back to accounts under my control. David received a formal apology from the prosecutor's office and a cash settlement for the legal expenses he'd incurred, defending against Jessica's false accusations. But the most important outcome wasn't financial. For the first time in 4 years, I felt like myself again. Not the confused and dependent widow who'd signed papers without understanding them, not the victim of sophisticated manipulation, but the strong woman Harold had married, and the determined mother who'd raised a successful daughter before that daughter chose greed over integrity. Margaret called the evening after the judge's ruling was announced, her voice warm with genuine congratulation, rather than gossip-seeking curiosity. "Ellen, I heard about the court decision. I'm so proud of you for fighting back and winning." "Thank you, Margaret. It wasn't about winning, really. It was about refusing to be victimized by someone I'd trusted completely." "Well, you've certainly set an example for the rest of us about standing up for ourselves when people take advantage." 6 months later, I received a letter from Jessica. Not an apology, not an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, but a carefully worded note suggesting that we might be able to rebuild our relationship now that the legal proceedings were concluded. I read the letter twice, looking for some sign of genuine remorse or honest recognition of the pain she'd caused. Instead, I found the same manipulative language she'd always used, framing her theft as a misunderstanding and my legal action as an overreaction that had damaged our family unnecessarily. I put the letter in Harold's desk drawer with other documents I wanted to keep, but didn't need to review regularly. David remarried last spring, a kindergarten teacher named Sarah who treats him with the respect and honesty he deserves. They invited me to their wedding, a small ceremony in his parents' backyard that was everything Jessica's courthouse marriage hadn't been. Family-centered, joyful, genuine. I've started telling new stories now. Not just the old family histories about great-grandmother's resilience during the Great Depression, but new stories about a 62-year-old woman who discovered that her daughter had been stealing from her and decided to fight back, rather than accept victimization. These stories aren't about ancient family legends. They're about contemporary choices, about the decision to value dignity over convenience, truth over comfortable lies, justice over family harmony built on deception. The Bridge Club ladies ask me to tell these stories at their meetings now, especially when someone mentions problems with adult children or concerns about financial security. They want to hear about what it takes to stand up to people who assume your age and emotional vulnerability make you an easy target for manipulation. I've become the example in our community of what's possible when women refuse to be victims, even when the perpetrators are people we've loved and trusted completely. Last week, a neighbor brought her elderly mother to meet me. The woman was facing similar issues with a son who'd been managing her finances and making questionable decisions about her money. She wanted advice about how to regain control of her own financial affairs without destroying her family relationships. I told her the truth. Sometimes protecting yourself requires choices that feel like betrayals of people you love. Sometimes dignity costs more than you think you can afford. Sometimes the right decision is also the loneliest decision. But I also told her that living with integrity, even when it's difficult, is better than living comfortably with lies. The money Jessica returned has been invested conservatively in accounts that only I can access. My financial security is restored, my independence is protected, and my future is under my control rather than subject to someone else's agenda. More importantly, I sleep well at night knowing that when I was tested by someone who underestimated my strength and resolve, I chose to fight back rather than surrender. The stories I tell now are my own stories, and they end with victory rather than victimization. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.